Hello and welcome back. Today we start with lecture 3. We are in module 4 now, and within module 4 we have looked through lecture 1 and 2, where we have looked at different kinds of attitudes, language attitudes and identity. Today we will start with language ideology. This is another important aspect within the broader perspective as to depending on the speech community, as in how a community, how a group of people behave within the social context as well as within the linguistic context, because linguistic context does not function alone. Language is a social phenomenon. So, language and society, they will have an interaction at every level, and while deciding speech community also we have looked at that perspective. So, speech community, we have defined speech community and looked at various nuanced notions within that. So, that brings us to language ideology today. Now, this idea, there is a slight overlap between ideology and attitude. So, the term ideology is used in today's time when it is used for language related functions. It includes attitude and many other things, many other factors. So, let us look at the history of the term a little bit. This term was coined way back, the term ideology was coined way back in the 18th century. Initially, it was coined to mean a science of ideas. This has nothing to do with how we understand ideology today, but this is how it began. So, over time the meaning changed, the semantic expansion and semantic changes are a regular feature of language, same applied here as well. Within linguistics, the first mention that we find of using this term goes back to Silverstein, Michael Silverstein, and he is credited with first beginning the discussion on this topic. So, this is how he defined language ideology or linguistic ideology. Scholars use both the terms, so we will be using them interchangeably. So, he defines it as, and I quote, sets of beliefs about language articulated by users as a rationalization or justification of perceived language structure and use. So, the crux of the matter that he pointed out here is that the justification that the speaker has within their mind and the rationalization that underlines the certain kinds of viewpoints about language, both structure and use. So, what we think of a language X or a language Y, that justification of that is what is called ideology. So, throughout 1970s and 1980s, there were lots of diverse domains within language studies were using the term ideology. So, some of them I have quoted from Woolard 1992 here. So, there were studies in the name of grammatical ideology, purist ideology, language ideology, ideologies of standardization, ideology of language, so on and so forth. So, each of them you can see the references, a number of studies were carried out using these terms. So, in the 70s and 80s it was accepted, well accepted within the discipline. So, as a result of which in the 90s this was taken up as a valid term. In this, actually the discipline of, or let us say subdomain of language ideologies was officially or formally accepted in the 90s. So, given the background of 70s and 80s work on these lines, it became the term got a stronger footing, because there was already adequate literature available. So, the stronger footing within which one could systematically study language use, integrating speaker's perception of his or her language and social context. That is why it is easy to confuse ideology with attitude, but here we will look at the comparison in a bit, but this is how it happened. So, based on a number of studies in the 70s and 80s that all you tended to use the word ideology, in the 90s this became a formal adoption of the term language ideology. Why? Because this was considered to be a rather convenient term that could take care of multiple things. First was, then it could look at a systematic discipline that would focus on the speaker's perception, whereby they will have a justification and rationalization as well. So, the language and the social context and their perception about it. So, these are some of the domains that were already being looked at. Now, in the 90s they all got clubbed together under the same terminology of language ideology. So, metalinguistics, then attitude, loyalty, values, prestige, stigmatization, and number of things. So, now the new title proved one umbrella term that could take care of all of these domains. Another good reason that have been highlighted by some scholars is that a good reason for the choice of this term was that it highlights the social origin of thought. Our thought processes also have a lot of social angle to it. How we think what we think, how we judge certain parameters in the society actually has a social origin. So, from these two perspectives the terminology got a lot of support and it became a discipline in its subdiscipline, or let us say within socio and anthropological linguistics, this became a significant domain of research. And then eventually a lot of different definitions have also been offered. So, there are one of the older ones in 1990, Alan Ramsey followed the previous definition and he described language ideology as shared bodies of common sense notions about the nature of language in the world. So, the perception of the speakers, perception of people about the social perception about the language. Judith Irvine in 1989 again, the cultural system of ideas about social and linguistic relationships together with their loading of moral and political interests. So, you see the different definitions have brought to fore some different kinds of angles, but largely focusing on the language and its social context and how this interaction is perceived by people is what language ideology is all about. In today's time, slightly comparatively recent times, Eddington defines it as the situated, partial and interested character of conceptions and use of language. So, taken together the definitions typically focus on role of linguistic awareness in influencing and shaping language, political interests influencing ideas about language, and how people evaluate language and engage in communication. So, these are some examples that I have for you. There are many, but you get the idea. So, beliefs about the superiority or inferiority of certain language. This is one of the this is one of the bare minimum examples of language ideology. Each of us have an opinion, though we sometimes do not make it overt, but we do have an opinion about language X and language Y. Some languages are good, some are not so good, some are complex, some do not sound good, and so on. So, that is what we are talking about. So, the Ebonics debate, we talked about Ebonics debate in the previous lecture, then English only legislation. Similarly, beliefs about the adequacy of sign language, beliefs about language acquisition such as cultural practices in Samoa, Kaluli and Gapun communities, regarding children's exposure to speech. We have referred to some of these in the previous lecture as well, and we will have more examples later also. But these are some examples from diverse communities about how language ideology results in certain kinds of social behavior by the speech community, by the group of people who speak the language as well as outsiders. And then beliefs about language contact and multilingualism. One case in point is the Arizona Tiwa avoidance of loan words. So, when you want to maintain your distinct identity, you consciously and socially there is an agreement that we will not allow loan words in our language. That has happened in Arizona Tiwa. So, these are cases where language ideology has a manifestation in the social domain. So, as I was speaking, there is a bit of an overlap between attitude and ideology. So, attitude is the and I have quoted here from a from a recent study. So, how they define it, the explicit evaluation of particular languages and language varieties expressed by people as opinions and beliefs, and sometimes more negatively as prejudices. So, this is the overt, the expressed part of the understanding, that is what is attitude. On the other hand, ideology is shared and enacted often through opinions about how a particular language should be used, learned, its utility, aesthetics, so on and so forth. So, this is the underlying mechanism. So, while attitude is overt, ideology is covert, that is the primary difference between them. We can also say that attitude is one of the manifestations of ideology, whether you learn language or not, whether you learn a second language or not. For example, it is very common in a society where, in a bilingual or multilingual society, for the minority speakers to learn the majority language. It is sometimes imposed because the second language might be the standard language. However, whether the majority speaker learns the minority language or not, that will depend on the ideology. Do you think it is worth learning? That will be the hidden ideology. How you will show it in the real world? You might show it through your attitude of disdain to the minority language, and the enactment will be you will not learn the minority language. That is how we can parse this comparison. Now, the idea about language ideologies, and we talked about how many studies were carried out in 70s and 80s, but before that not much of support was there for such kind of an enterprise. So, going back in the time of Boa, in the early anthropologists, they treated language mainly as a categorization process and as a just on the basis of structure. They were not too much focused on the perception of the speaker, which some scholars have called false consciousness. What the speaker thinks of his or her language or her own language or somebody else's language were not considered good enough topic for research. That was during Boa's time. Then early to mid 20th century, linguistics, the structural linguistics, the field of structural linguistics focused on abstract systems and structural analysis, because that was their main point. Chomsky, again the focus was on the ideal, because native speakers are considered ideal hosts. So, not agents of change. So, again their perception was not part of the part of the things to consider. All of these changed, that is why we started with Silverstein. All of these changed with Silverstein's work. His work in 79 and 85, this reversed the trend that was there before him. So, by how did he reverse this? By showing that linguistic ideologies mediate between language structure, use, culture, and so on and so forth. So, language is not just its structure, but it is also how the speakers perceive and how these two things interact within the broader social and cultural background. So, this is how he brought about a major change within this, and then many other scholars also worked on this. So, Jacobson, Himes, Gumpers, etc., they highlighted non-referential and indexical functions, integrating context and local theories of speech, and so on and so forth. Late 1970s, 80s, again you have a number of scholars who have looked at this. So, practice theory is one important parameter, then political economy perspective, all of these emphasized the speaker's agency. The language is not just a tool that the speaker uses without thinking. The speaker does a lot of does include a lot of input into how they, depending on how they think the language should be used, how it should be structured, depending on the participants, depending on the context, and a number of other things. So, by late 20th century, language ideology became a central concept in linguistic anthropology, leading to influential work. A lot of scholarship is still ongoing. So, that is the background, that is the definition and the background. Now, let us look at how they are studied. language ideology is not a simple monolithic concept, it is rather a cluster concept. So, when we study language ideology, typically there are levels that are through which it is studied. So, there are 5 levels that are agreed upon by scholars. So, for example, group or individual interests, multiplicity of ideologies, awareness of speakers, mediating function, and the role of language ideology in identity construction. Identity we have already seen. So, that also has a relationship with language ideology. Let us break them down a little bit. So, first one is the group or individual interests. What this basically means is that language ideologies represent the perception of language and discourse that is constructed in the interest of a specific person or a group. Specific person will be relevant only when the specific person is a powerful person, but otherwise typically it relates to a group interest. So, depending on what you think about one language on various kinds of scales, like whether it is morally good, it is true, aesthetically pleasing, these are the things, these are the perspectives that you can take on a language, and this also comes from the way the socio-political environment of that language is. So, depending on that, you might consider a language aesthetically not very appealing or morally not very good. Various kinds of studies have taken place. For example, Errington has highlighted how colonial scholarship imposed European models, constructed non-Europeans as inferior and legitimized political projects. So, language has throughout history been a tool for subjugation for the conquered people. So, when the Europeans went to they discovered the world, which already existed anyway prior to their arrival. So, they brought their European model, got it imposed on the locals, and the primary perspective was that European languages are superior, non-European languages were inferior. So, this has to do with the group's interest. When you want to control a population, you want to make them feel inferior first. That is what we mean by group interest. Similarly, multiplicity of ideologies. So, breaking it down to simpler terms, what we mean is language ideologies are typically conceived as multiple because in terms of multiple, because the plurality of meaningful social division. In any particular given group, there might be subgroups, there always are subgroups. So, for example, this grouping will be class, gender, clan, generation, and all those bases will be utilized. We have looked at this already, networks and so on. So, even within a larger group, there might be smaller groups. Now, each of them will have their individual identities, individual ideologies and so on. So, sometimes there might be conflicts and competition between them. So, formulations of language ideologies within a population might be in competition based on this kind of parameters. No community is homogeneous, and hence this is also a very common thing to witness. So, internal diversity within a society can drive language change. This is also from Errington's study. So, as a result of which multiplicity, the idea of multiplicity in terms of ideology highlights this aspect. The third perspective is that of awareness of speakers. Now, members may display varying degrees of awareness of local language ideologies. So, Silverstein said this: an institutional site of social practice as both object and modality of ideological expressions. So, basically religious sites like ritual speech and so on and so forth might create ideologies or might help form the ideologies and have add to the awareness of the speakers. So, multi-sidedness has been one topic that has come up recently. Basically, this points to language ideologies may be tied to multiple overlapping sites, both where they are produced and where they are commented upon. So, the ideologies can generate from one group, let us say one religious site or a political site or multiplicity, and depending on that the awareness level and as to how the speakers will ultimately act on it will change. Mediating function of ideology is self-explanatory. So, members' language ideologies mediate between social structures and forms of talk. So, the way you understand, the way your ideology is, accordingly you will be using the language or you will judge the language used by others. So, for example, there are three types, there are three ways in which this has been analyzed by Irvine and Gall 2000. So, they call it iconization, fractal recursivity and eraser. Iconization is, for example, a language feature is seen as a symbol of the people who use it. So, many African languages have a sound called click sound. So, the question clicks are seen as animal like. So, this is a reflection of the ideology towards this language. This is an iconization of the people based on the language. Then you have fractal recursivity, social differences like us and them getting repeated at smaller or bigger scale in language. So, this differentiation, this fraction within the society and so on. And eraser, of course, some differences are ignored or hidden to fit an ideology. The last is the language ideology in identity construction. This is also understandable. Sometimes national or ethnic unity through shared language typically tends to hide the social inequality. So, if you have that kind of an ideology, you will try to hide the smaller differences and so on. For example, standard English and standard Indonesian have been studied by Arrington 2000, symbolize nations, but mainly serve elite interests. So, these are things that have been being looked at, that are studied within the language ideology. Of late, there are couple of developments within this broader field. One of them is the historiography of language ideology. How did it come about? What are the changes that have taken place historically speaking in a diachronic perspective? What are the changes? So, the emphasis is on the across time kind of the change across time. For example, the questions that they typically ask: how do language ideologies come about? What makes the difference between successful language ideology, which becomes dominant, and the other less successful one. So, historically what are those factors, what are those properties in the larger social life that creates a successful ideology versus an unsuccessful ideology. That is one way of strand of research that is going on now. Secondly, the study of the role of language ideology in construction of identities. Now, identity has been studied for quite some time now, but current focus from language ideology perspective is how ideology and identity go hand in hand. How does ideology create identities? So, a number of languages, number of groups have been studied in the recent times. For example, in Rapa Nui, a puristic variety of the language has developed, influenced by the Spanish based linguistic purism. So, the ideology of purism has impacted a particular language where they are they have actually created a variety of language, thereby to identify themselves with. So, these are the recent trends. Language ideologies are crucial to understand subordinated, converted and appropriated identities. That is another domain that is being studied, how over time things change. So, in one particular study, children exposed to dominant institutional language ideologies begin to perceive deficiencies in their own language. Ideologies can be through institutions like education and various other type of institutions can propagate certain kinds of ideology, as a result of which the people on whom these lectures have been applied may end up imbibing those ideologies. So, this is one such case. In case of Zentela's study, the children actually started to think that their own language skills had some deficiencies. This is also possible. So, these are some of the domains that are studied now. For example, similar patterns of subordinate and converted identities are observed in context affected by colonialism and missionary activity. This is another interesting domain of study. So that you are made to feel bad about yourself. So, as a result of which you imbibe the the ideology that has been given to you by the colonizers or similar such forces. So, these such forces significantly influence language ideology, especially in the Pacific region, that has been studied by many scholars. So, this is about language ideology. A related concept that I want to touch upon briefly is the idea of linguistic human rights. Ideology, identity, attitude and human rights are all connected. So, what is language right? Simply put, language right refers to using your own language in everyday life, in every sphere of life, right. So, language rights actually became a movement some time back. So, this typically talks about discrimination faced by ethnic minorities. So, the minority communities, typically ethnic minority communities, often face discrimination because their language is not the standard language of the place, as a result of which over time there is a shift to the more powerful language, resulting in the initially in the and the attrition of the first language, eventually it might even lead to language death. So, given this kind of a reality staring at their faces and the face of the linguistics community, this language right movement came about. So, the speakers of the ethnic minorities, they often face discrimination at various levels and including language. For example, they are not allowed, in certain cases they are not even allowed to use their language. So, that is how it came into being. So, there are two kinds of rights that we talk about within linguistic human rights. One is called tolerance oriented rights, the other is promotion oriented rights. Tolerance oriented rights is refers to when the community is, as the name suggests, the community and their language is tolerated, in the sense that they can use the language only at home or in a close knit social domains, but not for any kind of official or higher purposes. That is when we have so home and close knit social functions, etc. These are the domains where you can use the the minority language, and they should remain confined within these domains. On the other hand, we have promotion oriented rights. Now, this is generally not the pattern. Ethnic minorities are generally not given promotion based oriented rights. What it basically means is that you are free to exercise learning and teaching of your language. So, you can promote your language, but this is easier said than done, because it does not always happen. So, these are the primary things. So, let us look at a few of the major movements related to linguistic human rights. First is the language ecology movement. Language ecology movement primarily focused on language, not the people per se. Now, not the people who speak the language, but language itself, because the idea here comes from the understanding of ecosystem, maintaining the ecosystem. So, this is this is understood with respect to preservation of language, and because when you preserve language, you preserve cultural knowledge system, you preserve a lot of other things on that was coded in the language itself. So, biological we all know about biological diversity. So, this is situated within that. So, they use both biological metaphors such as murder, endangerment, extinction, death, etc. Within this field, they use these terms to refer to the gradual loss of language, and language death is equated with cultural death, because once the language is gone, all the information that was coded into it, the conceptualization of various knowledge that is relevant to the community and the place, the flora, the fauna and so on and so forth, are also gone. So, that is why it is considered very important to preserve the language, and the perspective this movement takes is from the biological diversity perspective. So, that is one of the most important aspects of language rights movement. Now, in this within this broader domain, there are different kinds of work that has been going on for some time now. So, they come in contact, they work with the small groups, small ethnic minority groups who speak the language. Sometimes they try to revitalize the language, sometimes just to maintain its use. So, some cases where the language is already facing a lot of challenges may not be they may not be able to revitalize it, but wherever they can, they do use certain kinds of models. One is called the language nest model, within which this can be put to use. What does language nest model do? The fluent elder speakers of the language, in this case the elder speakers of the language are fluent. There are still people who speak the language, mostly the older people. So, they take the responsibility of teaching the children how to speak and leave the language. For example, this has been applied in the Maori in New Zealand. So, this usually is feasible with communities with written material, because only when you have adequate cultural artifacts in the language, it is possible for revitalization. Maori was revitalized using this method. On the other hand, there is another method called master apprenticeship model, apprentice model. This was followed in California in 1992. So, here the problem of language is rather severe. Here the older speakers themselves are not very fluent, and as a result of which they have not been transmitting the language, they have not been using the language very often, and so on. So, in this case you cannot revitalize the language, but the best you can do is you can, whoever is speaking the language, they can become the master, and all the other people can be the apprentice, and together they can continue using the words of the language in certain domains, in real life activities. That is how they do. So, taking help from masters from within the community and putting them together with apprentices who are expected to learn the basic skills over a period of time, and they can use this. So, when we say that they are trying to use it real life, we mean that the day to day life, real life activities, while they are doing it, they should be able to talk about it and converse with each other in their own language. That is the goal of this model. This model, within this model, revitalization is not generally not possible, because of the severity of the endangerment of the language. So, one well known scholar Mufene has said that language endangerment is a more wicked problem than has been acknowledged in the literature, because sometimes it boils down to saving lives of the speakers and saving the language. So, you have a choice between being alive and being able to speak the language, and that doesn't really make things very easy. So, for example, some cases from history where the speaking or not speaking a particular language decided life and death for the speakers. Such examples I have added here from El Salvador, similarly Gapun in Papua New Guinea, and then Southeast China. So, in the Sui clans have clanlects in China. So, language varieties differentiated along clanlects. Clans. So, different clans have different languages, and often what happens is that marriage happens outside the clan, not inside the clan. So, the woman gets married and goes to the husband's clan, and there the job to teach language to the child is, of course, falls on the mother, and who herself is an outsider. So, in such cases there is not much of a chance to maintain the mother's language, because she also has to learn the husband's language, and that transmit that. So, these are some problems that Mufene talks about, that sometimes it is simply not possible to maintain the language. Then we have linguistic human rights movement. So, first was the ecology, now the human rights movement. This is situated within and draws strength from the human rights movement, equating language with other basic human rights. So, just like we have right to life, right to food, right to safety, right to liberty, we also have right to language, our own language, speaking our own language. So, distinctive characteristic of the movement is that these are considered necessary and basic need rather than enrichment ones. Language is a basic need, basic human need. This is the perspective that linguistic human rights movement typically focuses on. So, because mother tongue is inalienable, they call it inalienable. So, mother tongue simply cannot be left out, you simply cannot discard it. So, every community has a right to learn their language and use it in every domain of life as the basic right. So, they include individual and collective rights. Individual right is the right to learn one's mother tongue and have it have this identification accepted and respected by others. So, every individual within that minority community, ethnic minority community, have the right to not only learn, but also to practice. And the use the mother tongues in most official situations, including schools, and everybody whose mother tongue is not the official language of the country has the right to become bilingual or trilingual in the mother tongue and the official language. That is the standpoint that they take. Similarly, you have collective rights within this. So, basically ensuring that indigenous people are allowed to, so in place of individuals, now we are talking about people, allowed to reproduce themselves as a distinct group with their own language and culture. That is the idea. The idea of choice basically is the element, most key element in this. So, you have a choice that you can, but the choice only to choose the second language, choice does not apply to your mother tongue. Mother tongue is a given, right. So, it is not an issue, because the supporters of this movement say that even when the shift is voluntary, they argue that the speakers were not informed about the consequences of this shift to second language. So, the idea here is that they should be given a choice, right. Third is the minority language rights movement. They are all similar, but the slight change in focus. So, in the first case it was understood to be understood from the perspective of diversity, ecological diversity, the second one from human rights perspective, and the third is minority rights. So, this is set within the bigger background of the democratic rights. Now, this movement aims at initiating dialogue between the dominant and the dominated through equality. So, this is about democracy. Even though a minority, ethnic minority group may not have too many speakers, the language may not be the standard language and so on and so forth, but within a democracy they should be treated equally. That is the idea. So, language is given importance as a significant aspect of the group's identity. Protection of language rights as critical part of liberal democratic perspective. So, language is a group right, that is the idea. Now, there are problems with all of these movements, though it is of course, we all agree that all languages have right to be used, be learned and be practiced in all domains of life. However, there are some problems that also cannot be ignored. One is the speaker's perspective. Often what happens, the ethnic minority language, due to various kinds of social pressures, just does not have the appeal that it should have to the speakers themselves. So, the speaker's perspective sometimes do not quite align with the movement's advocates. Sometimes the speakers themselves simply do not want to continue using their language or take up the movement very seriously. That is one. Second is the historical inevitability, because languages change, power structure changes, societies change, social practices change all the time. So, as a result of which a lot of changes that happen with respect to the power structure and the hierarchy in the society are inevitable. We cannot really reverse it or stop it. That is the second one. Third problem that have been pointed out is the mobility and use. Why to actively limit the mobility of minority groups by insisting on them speaking their native language? In today's world, nobody is actually a monolingual. People move all the time, social mobility, and as of 2025, internet has changed the whole world. So, people will always move, or at least they are aware of the other parts of the world and so on and so forth. So, they may not simply stick to their native language, and we should not force them. That is the third thing. And the macro point is that claims towards codification and homogenization of the language and the group, and the micro problems of language practices of individuals within the group. So, codification and homogenization of languages is also one big problem. There are sometimes resistance, which part, even if it is a minority language, there might be many varieties within that. So, tackling those problems are also not very easy. But anyways, these are important ideas to look at when we are discussing about speech community and how they typically how these interaction plays out. We have seen already through attitude, identity, ideology, and today also we looked at language rights. So, this is where we complete lecture 3. In lecture 4, we will take up another topic within this broader domain. Thank you.